Hello and welcome to episode 36 of Fergo and the Freak. I'm that bloke from Rugby League Project, Andrew Ferguson. You can find me on Twitter at AndrewRLP. And joining me as always is the affable League Freak, who you can find on Twitter at League Freak. How you doing there?
Hello everyone.
How's it going?
Pretty good. And a big shout out to Warwick Moss. Hope you're doing well, Warwick.
Yeah, we had a good chat about him. People may not know, or they may do. He was the voice on the That's Rugby League documentary that was filmed around probably a bit over 15 years ago now. If you haven't seen it, go check it out. It's brilliant.
It's really good, yeah.
Speaking of history of rugby league, today we're going to be looking at the history of State of Origin and looking at the what we've called the Wally Lewis Era and the period of time leading up to it.
Yeah, so we're going to do basically a three-part series looking at State of Origin because the way we saw it, there was three main eras in rugby league. The first one was dominated by Wally Lewis, and I think it's fair to call it the Wally Lewis Era. The second era we felt was Brad Fittler, Andrew Johns era. A little bit of overlap there because in between, but we felt like that was probably the best way to describe it. That we started off with the Wally Lewis era where Queensland were quite dominant, and then it moved into the Fittler era where New South Wales kind of got to the point where they were actually leading a lot of the statistics in State of Origin. And then the last part, which is basically going to be what we will term almost the Immortals era, where Queensland have like just a group of probably, I mean, what could you say? It's probably 15, maybe even 20 players that were just absolutely incredible, around about the same age, and just an amazing run that they went on. So we're going to break it into three separate podcasts, and it'll allow us to focus a little bit on the games and the series and some of the storylines and things like that. So we hope you enjoy it.
Absolutely. Let's get into it. So interstate football began back in 1908, and even then Queensland were at a disadvantage because they didn't even have a rugby league competition in the state at the time. Their first competition was in 1909 in Brisbane. A few other country outliers also started up their comp then as well. So New South Wales won the first ever interstate game 43-0. Using today's scorelines, that would have actually been a scoreline of 52-0, just to show you how dominant it was.
Those were the days.
Yeah. South winger Tommy Anderson scored 4 tries in that match. Tommy McCabe got 2. Arthur Butler, Billy Can, Sid Dean, they all crossed for 1 each. The immortal Daly Messenger kicked 8 goals.
Wow.
The second game saw New South Welshman Pat Welsh make his rugby league debut. He wasn't even a Queenslander.
Wow.
He was playing for Queensland just hours after arriving in Australia on via a boat trip from New Zealand, where he'd been playing rugby union.
That's pretty incredible that he just got off the boat and went straight to a state match.
Yeah, he was being told about the key differences between the two games on the journey from the docks to the ground.
Wow, that's incredible.
So New South Wales also fielded a weaker side to try and make it a more even contest, and they still end up winning the game, but this time the scoreline was only 12-3.
Oh, wow. Queenslanders were really struggling. It's interesting because I guess back then, with where rugby league was, it was almost like a entrepreneurial exhibition match that they would have been thinking to themselves, listen, we need to make money out of these games going forward, and if this is one-sided, it will be all over pretty soon. So they were looking at ways to make it more competitive back then. Exactly right.
So, and they needed to be competitive in more places than just Sydney as well if they were going to be successful.
Mm-hmm.
So, I suppose evidence of that was earlier in the year when Queensland played their first few games. They were against the New Zealand team that were returning from their journey to England.
Mm-hmm.
And they played the first game against the All Golds and were beaten 34-12. So for the second game, Daly Messenger lined up for Queensland. He became their first player to play for the state who wasn't actually from there.
Oh, wow. That's interesting.
His appearance, he scored a try and 3 goals, which was 9 points then, in the 12-all draw with the New Zealand side. That's how much of an input and how much of an impact he had.
It'd be interesting to see. Um, that would be a great like trivia question. If you said somebody, how many games did Dally Messenger play for Queensland? You know,
That's exactly right. Um, so yeah, after that, New South Wales won the first 22 games between the two states, scoring a total of 749 points to Queensland's 223, which was an average scoreline of 34-10.
very one-sided.
In 1922, Queensland finally scored their first ever win over the Blues. It was the start of a very successful period for Queensland where they won 8 straight games and 17 of 24 matches from 1922 to 1928. The 1930s were then dominated by New South Wales again, and that dominance continued after 1940, which saw 130 games played, with New South Wales winning 102. There were 6 drawn games, and Queensland won just 22 matches.
Now, the thing about a lot of this that needs to be remembered is that Queensland started producing really, really good players. Like once they got their local competition going and they were producing amazing players in their own right. But all of the money was, or the big money was basically in Sydney, in the Sydney competition. And these teams were residence teams. So if you lived in New South Wales, even if you were born in Queensland, raised in Queensland, all of that, you had to play for Queensland. And it really skewed the competition, and you can see it in those results because all of these great Queenslanders that would come down to Sydney clubs as professional sportsmen, they would end up playing for New South Wales against Queensland. And I mean, you look at how long it lasted that they were just hammering Queensland over and over again.
That's exactly right. In 1971, Ron McAuliffe became both a senator and the chairman of the Queensland Rugby League. So he was a senator in the Australian Parliament. Mm-hmm. And became the chairman of the Queensland Rugby League. He initially set about trying to stop Sydney clubs poaching Queensland talent, as it both hampered the Queensland competition and also, as you said, saw those Queenslanders playing against New South Wales and beating their own state. McAuliffe introduced state-based contracts and long ones as well in an effort to try and stop that flow of players south. And then in 1977, he got the first initial idea of a state of origin concept after noticing the immediate switch in results of the VFL games that were played between Victoria and Western Australia. So in the first game in 77, Victoria belted Western Australia by 63 points. 4 months later, they played a return match under state of origin rules, and Western Australia flogged Victoria by 94 points. McAuliffe looked at that and thought, that looks like a similar thing that would happen if we did that in rugby league.
Mm-hmm. And it's interesting that once again in rugby league, and we've seen this time and time again over a lot of the innovations in the game, you need a central person that is driving the change. It can't be by committee. It needs somebody that really takes it upon themselves and says, this is what we've got to do, and they really campaign for it and push it along.
Yeah, and McAuliffe was great at that. And he was, I suppose, the whole origin concept would not have got ahead if he hadn't have had the cooperation and openness to it that he got from the New South Wales Rugby League boss, Kevin Humphreys, at the time. Because he was really keen on the idea as well when it was put to him. In 1980, a meeting was held involving a delegate from each New South Wales Rugby League club where they decided whether state of origin should go ahead. The vote got up 9 votes to 3. The 3 clubs who voted against it, just so you can hate on them if you like, were St George, South Sydney, and the Roosters.
There you go. I wonder why they voted no. I wonder if it had anything to do with, I mean, for the Roosters, they liked getting Queensland players. But yeah, I wonder what their reasons were for voting against it. It might have just been the personal preference of the people that were casting the votes.
It could have been. I mean, given that they were, I suppose, officially, the 3 traditional clubs, they'd been formed in 1908. Mm-hmm. Maybe they just saw it as a traditionalist idea that they should stick with.
Yeah, possibly. And the interesting thing about it too is that back then those clubs would have carried a lot of weight.
Absolutely. The New South Wales Rugby League and the Country Rugby League they were both hugely in support of this. The Country Rugby League is understandable given that there was a very similar record between Sydney or City and the Country Rugby League games over pretty much over the same period, where City just dominated in such an oppressive manner almost, that after every series for a long time, especially through the 50s and 60s, you'd always hear articles coming up saying, should we just get rid of City versus Country? It's pointless.
Yeah.
And the same talk was starting to come up about interstate games, to the point where the last few games were played at Leichhardt Oval in front of meagre crowds.
Yeah, and like shockingly small crowds. Like I think it was 1,500 people for the game leading into the first State of Origin game. It was an afterthought, and it's really weird to think that even if you played those games with the residency rule in place now in the NRL, I mean, imagine playing in front of 1,500 people. It'll be like being at a Roosters game.
Or a Super League game.
Yeah.
On July 8th, 1980 at Lang Park, the first ever State of Origin game was played, where Queensland won 20-10 in what was just a one-off match to see how it would go. They had two interstate games were played earlier that year, and New South Wales won both of those, 35-3 and 17-7. So
now before we talk about the State of Origin game itself, right?
Mm-hmm.
I would like to read some of the quotes from people in the media.
Good idea.
Yeah, what they said leading into the State of Origin game. And it's interesting because me and you talked about this the other night, and we see patterns in a lot of the things in rugby league history, and this was just a giant red flag pattern that was in the game with how people talked about this. So there was three main quotes that jumped out at me when we were researching this. The first one was from the Daily Mirror's Ron Casey. I believe Ron Casey passed away recently, unfortunately, but he called it basically a phony promotion, and he said, quote, "To the Queensland Hillbillies in Premier John's Bananaland, State of Origin match might be a big idea. But those in the land of the living, here in Sydney, it's just another match without meaning." Ray Warren, who it's kind of weird to think about him writing for the Sunday Telegraph, said, "I know a lot of people are upset at the go-ahead of the State of Origin game, but I congratulate those who pushed it through. Queensland and New South Wales country areas need an injection of life, and this match can do nothing but good for the game north of the border." The last one that I thought was interesting was from Bob Fulton, and he was the coach of Eastern Suburbs, I believe. So that probably says where they were coming from. He said in the Daily Mirror, "Rugby League's non-event of the century will be staged in Brisbane next month. A totally useless State of Origin clash between New South Wales and Queensland. Only the $30,000 gate could make it acceptable to administrators. No Sydney club could possibly want the match, but no doubt it will go ahead. As far as I'm concerned, it's strictly a non-event and will achieve absolutely nothing." So it was interesting that back then in the media, there was a lot of rubbishing it, that it was just, we saw non-event there. And then there were those that sort of thought this is needed. And it's interesting to think about having those two different opposing sides, and it's kind of a shock that the concept got up, really.
It is when you got someone like Bob Fulton saying he's not mincing with his words there. He's pretty clear-cut with what he's trying to say. He was definitely opposed this from the start. I wonder if we'll find a quote later on down the line in a future episode where he regrets what he said.
Yeah.
There's non-event. Wow.
Yeah, kind of. It's funny that there are some events in rugby league that you can look back and say, wow, that was a real moment in the history of the game. There's few bigger than that first State of Origin game. And yeah, I wouldn't like to have gone into a game like that saying, "Oh, this is going to be a non-event."
Oh, exactly. I would have thought that Fulton might have been a bit more open to it, given that one of his teammates was Arthur Beetson for a while there during the 70s.
Yeah, and especially, Although I guess the residency thing was something that Bob Thornton knew a lot about because he was born in England and played for Australia. So there you go.
Yeah, that's probably true. Um, so yeah, so with the results there in 1980,
Mm,
McAuliffe's feelings from 1977 when he watched those VFL games were justified. He saw that and went, okay, it did happen in rugby league.
hmm
The New South Wales Rugby League decided to use the same system again the next year, where they had the two games played under the residential rule and the one game at the end under Origin rules, and the same thing happened again. So New South Wales won 10-2 and then 22-5, and then in the standalone Origin fixture, Queensland won 22-15.
Yeah, and the interesting thing about the first two State of Origin games, man of the match was Chris Close, our good friend Choppy. So, a pretty cool thing for him to have on his resume.
Absolutely. The change in results and the improvement in the Queensland side, the increased TV viewing numbers, the good gates, all of it pointed to State of Origin being much better for the game and much better for both states. So it was decided then that the residential-based or interstate series was going to be scrapped as of 1982, and they would adopt a full State of Origin series from then on.
Yeah, and it's kind of weird that it took a couple of years to do. And I guess at this point in time, it was still an experiment, which is really weird to think about.
Exactly. So quickly going back to the 1980 game, and while it was considered a non-event, especially when you had incidents such as, Immortal and the late Arthur Beetson being called back at the age of 35, I think he was, from Parramatta's reserve grade to captain Queensland. I think people saw that as being making somewhat of a mockery of it, or it was just going to be a bit of a joke game. They didn't realise how passionate and how determined Beetson was about this idea. And he pulled out one of his greatest performances of his career for this match. And one of the big moments in that match was when he hit teammate of Parramatta, Mick Cronin, in a tackle. And some people have referred to it as the punch that made Origin, because it was two teammates starting to have a fight with one another. Straight away we saw that this was a war between two states, and that's how it's going to be.
Yeah, and he probably grabbed him and just put one on him. Like, it wasn't, they were holding nothing back. And I guess that's also where the mate against mate, state against state sort of thing really was born. And it was, Arthur Beetson. And it proved to be something that has carried on through the entire series, where you will very often see teammates belting the hell out of each other. And it's interesting that you look at the way that it has probably had an effect on some of the Australian teams over the years when they would get selected, and there would sometimes be hangover from the State of Origin series. But there's no doubt that, it has done so much for Australian Rugby League and its rise to be completely dominant, not only off the field, but on the field and in the test arena as well.
That's exactly right. So 1980 saw, obviously, Mal Meninga playing as well for Queensland there. There was quite a few handy Queenslanders in that side. Obviously, Wally Lewis was there. A bit of trivia, though, is that Wally Lewis was not at 5'8" in that game where he played most of his career. He actually started at lock.
Yeah, that's an incredible, once again, another really good trivia question. It's kind of crazy to think that pretty much anyone in the history of the game could push Wally Lewis from 5'8" to lock.
Yeah, he was. The Queensland halves in that game were Alan Smith and Greg Oliphant. It worked, but in 1981 they decided to put Lewis into his usual position of 5'8", and he was captain as well.
And it was pretty quickly evident that Wally Lewis was something special in this arena, and naming him as captain, one of the great moves in rugby league history, because he was really a rallying point for Queensland. Still is.
Yeah, exactly. He ran with the ball that Beaton had, I guess, with that passion there because he played with the same amount of passion for that state as anyone else, if not more so.
Yeah, yeah, and I mean, he's like state of origin, Wally Lewis, man. They got a statue out of it.
Yeah, they did. So the 1981 game is remembered mostly for two things, and that was Les Boyd pretty much teeing off against anything that was maroon,
Hmm.
and a try by Chris Close at the end where he gave Eric Gross one of the strongest, fiercest backhanders you'll ever see. Oh God, watching it back the other day, I was like, God, that is brutal. He did not miss.
Yeah, the way to describe it is Growth makes an amazing try-saving tackle right at the try line. Like he chases the Maroons play down. And he gets him around the legs. It's a legs tackle. Chris Close grabs him by the back of his hair, picks him up, slams his face down against the player's legs, picks him up again so he's in a prone position, and just does this swinging back fist. Then picks up the ball from dummy half and scores a try. Absolutely amazing. And it makes you think about what would happen if that happened in a State of Origin game these days. Like how many weeks he'd miss, the try would not be given, all this sort of stuff. And yet it's this amazing moment, and you've really got to see it. Really incredible moment in the game.
And it's not something that you go, oh, the referee just missed it. I mean,
No.
There was no one else around. The referee had no obstruction. He just went, that's fine by me. Play on.
Yeah, it was just all of a sudden, Chris Close just assaults someone and then scores a try.
It was, oh boy. But it showed more than anything the level that New South Wales needed to play at.
Yeah, yeah.
And they struggled to get there. 1982, Beaton was coach for Queensland, and Queensland again dominated, winning the series. Ron McAuliffe threatened to abandon future Origin games if the Sydney clubs continued to make life difficult for Queensland to have access to their players that were playing in Sydney.
Yeah, and I guess, I mean, that would have been the start of really the representative camps that we know today, and are just, we're just so used to them. And I guess it's weird to think that they started somewhere as well. It makes you wonder how, in the first couple of games, how quick the Queensland teams had to gel. Like if it was just a couple of days or something that they all flew in. But yeah, I guess that was the start of our big Origin camps that we now are just so used to.
Yeah, I guess too in those days, the New South Wales players were pretty much all playing in the one competition in Sydney, whereas all of the Queensland players are playing in the Brisbane competition and the Sydney competition. So
yeah.
This showed too, once again, how much more seriously Queensland were taking this than New South Wales were.
Yeah. Yeah, they wanted to prepare for this. They didn't just want to rock on up on the day. And it does. It shows that this meant more to them early on than it did to New South Wales. And I guess the thing from a New South Wales point of view at this point too is that you've still got to carry all of the winning history that they had in interstate matches into these when you think about State of Origin. And New South Wales had moments in their history where Queensland would win a game here or there. But so it would be very easy to not really understand the gravity of what was happening up in Queensland around State of Origin at this time, from New South Wales point of view, especially when the media were very dismissive of the concept, still to a certain extent, and dismissive of the Brisbane competition in general.
Exactly. It was also in 1983, jumping ahead there, we also saw the first part of some of the mind games about favouritism between, usually levelled by Queensland against New South Wales. They started to happen around there. And it was fueled by the fact that on the 1982 Kangaroo Tour, Brett Kenny replaced Wally Lewis in the Australian team for the Ashes winning series. And a lot of Queenslanders thought that there was complete bias there because the Australian coach was also the New South Wales State of Origin coach.
Yeah.
And so that
And
fueled a whole heap of other speculation from there, which was just another motivating factor for Queensland that New South Wales were also not prepared for.
yeah, and really was the spark of paranoia that Queenslanders, I know you'll be upset hearing that, but let's face it, you're paranoid. You really are. And it comes from things like that. And I think if that happened in this day and age, people would kind of look at it a little bit different. For instance, if Mal Meninga was the Queensland and Australian coach, and he wanted to lean towards Queenslanders, I think that people would be like, yeah, he kind of knows what he wants out of a team. He's got the results and things like that. But that sort of paranoia and that, I don't know, like that distrust of the New South Wales establishment, it carries on even to today. Even when you look at all of the success that Queensland have had, there's still that complete distrust of, the big wigs in Sydney. They're out to get us.
It's a deep-seated hatred, and it's spilled into other areas, which we'll get into later, outside of State of Origin. We could argue that it was part of the distrust that went on between the Broncos and the New South Wales Rugby League that saw about the Super League war. But that's for another discussion.
Yeah.
1983 was the birth of Brett Kenny versus Wally Lewis. Two of the greatest 5'8" this country's produced.
What a showdown, hey? Unbelievable.
Phenomenal. Now, 1984 saw the first time that New South Wales started taking State of Origin seriously, where it was small steps, but they started to insist that all clubs who had players named in the New South Wales Origin side, they insisted that they stand those players down the week before each Origin game is to be played, so they get properly prepared and train in order to win the games. They didn't win the series in 84, but it did have a profound effect because in 1985 they won their maiden Origin series, and we've got that iconic image of Steve Mortimer on his knees, sort of relieved with his arms pointing up towards the air in celebration after winning Game 2, which just happened to be on my birthday.
Oh, wow. Interesting. That's cool. And the thing is, too, you finally saw that New South Wales realised they had a challenge on their hands and that it was something to achieve to win this series once again. And, I mean, that's had a big effect on the series as well. And I think sometimes New South Wales has lost that at times. A lot of people feel as though State of Origin is at its best when, like, New South Wales has to overcome Queensland. And I tell you what, it's hard to argue against that.
It is. The good thing about this series is it was the first time we actually got two teams passionate and dedicated to the series. And when New South Wales getting up, you just knew it was the one thing Queensland needed to anger them and get them more fired up for the next series and moving on from there. And it really did have that impact.
Yeah.
Because another thing that happened in 85 was we saw Steve Roach come into the New South Wales side. And he took over from a previous firebrand in Les Boyd. And he was one of those players who Queenslanders loved to hate because Blocker didn't take a backward step. More often than not, he'd start a game and his sole aim was to go out and find someone to hit. And that was very Les Boyd of him.
Yeah, and one of the interesting things about as we go into from 85 and into 86, and 86 was a tremendous series for New South Wales. And when you look at their teams, the team hardly changed at all for New South Wales in the whole series. But you start to see some of the players come in who it's almost like you're seeing some of the older players leave the team at this point for New South Wales, and the players that are coming into it are State of Origin era players, and they're really the first generation of our State of Origin players, where the Queensland players, I mean, it seemed as though their first generation was from Game 1. It felt like these two series were our first generation of New South Wales State of Origin players.
I fully agree, especially when you had a lot of young guys like, they hadn't been in there yet, but you knew they were coming, like Greg Alexander. You still had Laurie Daly to come. These guys were kids who grew up watching the State of Origin and getting what it was about and getting how important it was.
Yeah.
Whereas the players who were playing at the time had been playing, some have been playing in the 70s when New South Wales just flogged Queensland all the time. And so they had this dismissive view of interstate games.
Mm-hmm.
They didn't grow up with the hatred that Queensland had for constantly being beaten all the time. And being dismissed so easily, I guess.
Yeah, and it's a different mindset, and you see it sometimes in rugby league. I mean, I think there's been times where we've seen it at test level for Australia, where Australia will go through the motions and kind of just win. And it's a good thing when that gets broken eventually, because you see teams and players and everything, they dedicate themselves to overcoming a challenge. And I think that once New South Wales finally got what Origin was about, it really solidified the series, because now it wasn't just Queensland beating the crap out of New South Wales and sort of getting payback for all those years that they'd lost. Now all of a sudden this was a genuine contest, and you didn't know who was going to win going into these games, and you had players that were starting to lift to a new level to beat one another in these contests.
Absolutely. And it was only further enhanced in 1986 when New South Wales won in a clean sweep.
Mm-hmm.
Because straight away Queensland's taken back to those games prior to Origin where they're just getting beaten, well, not easily, but they're just getting beaten all the time.
Mm-hmm.
And this sparked a bit of a revolution almost within the Queensland side. It took a few years for it to kick in, but there was a change in mentality. Some would say that in the 85, 86, 87 period, the aggression that they played with early on had dropped off a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
But by the end of the 80s, bloody hell, it came back again.
Yeah, with a vengeance.
Absolutely. I was going to say there was a few players in the 86 series who came through who were making their debut. I had them written down here because I can't remember off the top of my head.
Mm-hmm.
Let's see. Steve Folkes,
Yep.
David Gillespie, Peter Jackson for Queensland.
Good. Yeah.
Yep. Les Kiss for Queensland. Yeah, that's pretty much it. But there's also, we saw players like Gary Jack really nail down that position at fullback there for the Blues.
Mm-hmm.
Gary Belcher and Dale Shearer start to make a name for themselves as well in that arena.
One of the incredible things about this series, the 1986 series, the New South Wales team in the whole series only made like 3 changes.
Yeah,
they had Steve Morris, who they replaced with Brian Hetherington, and then Brian Johnson in the last game. And the only other change they made to anyone on the team was in Game 3, where Andrew Farrar was replaced by Eric Groth. And that is absolutely incredible. That's something that you just don't see anymore from either team, really.
Yeah. It was phenomenal how strong that unit was, that team that New South Wales had there, and how consistent they were. And it was because of that unity, as you said. It's something they haven't learned from.
No, not at all. It's making 1,000 changes. But I think one of the things that gets lost when people talk about changes in these State of Origin games is you have to be blessed with bringing together a unit of players that works really well together. And I think we've only seen that a few times in all of Origin history, where a team has been brought together and it has just worked pretty much straight away. They've all gelled. There's no need to change them. The vast majority of State of Origin, there's been changes needed to be made by both sides, and both sides have done it. And it's interesting that when you see teams put on really good performances and have a really good run, it's like being a group of players. They're all around the same age. They all gel really well. There's no need to make changes. They just all work as a unit. And I find it interesting. And I wonder if it's something you can predict or create, or if it's just luck.
It's I think it's probably fair to say to be a bit of both, to be honest.
Yeah.
But I think if you can build it and keep it, then it reduces the amount of luck required.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, 86 also saw the interstate coaching debut of one Wayne Bennett.
Yes.
replacing Arthur Beetson.
Yeah, and some great Wayne Bennett moments, some iconic Wayne Bennett moments at State of Origin level. Um, uh,
It's funny that he was able to, for such a placid sort of seeming human,
yeah,
that he was able to invoke such passion out of them and out of the Queensland state,
yeah.
given what was about to happen as well in the next few years,
Hmm.
and how they played for one another as a team and how much anger they had towards the Blues as well.
Yeah, and it's something that he's always been. I mean, he still does it to this day. He can solidify a team. He can take a team that is okay and pretty good and really make them play with a real steely determination. And that's his great strength as a coach, always has been.
That's right. 1987 came along, and we saw a host of new young players come into the game for both sides. Andrew Eddinghausen, Mark McGaw, Les Davidson, David Boyle, Martin Bella, Trevor Gilmeister, Alan Langer, who was told he was too small.
Yeah, it's crazy to think Alan Langer too small, and that he would terrorise New South Wales for nearly 20 years from that point on. The thing too is that Alan Langer was probably the first player, because he was almost plucked from obscurity from the point of view of the media and the big league, which was the New South Wales Rugby League. He's almost plucked from obscurity and just is a giant in the arena of giants, and was probably one of the first few players that was really in that mould. Wally Lewis had already been doing it. Arthur Beetson had shown that you could step up at the end of your career. And now this young kid that's way too small to be playing rugby league in general comes out, and all of a sudden it's like, what do we do with this dude? We can't stop him.
Yeah, he was phenomenal. A lot of people remember the infamous kiss on the forehead that Wally Lewis gave him as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
that was at the end of game 2 when Queensland won the series.
Yeah, and then we've got the famous exhibition match.
Yes, in a weird, I dare say we could call it a promotion attempt. The New South Wales Rugby League decided to take the State of Origin idea to California, where they played a fourth game. Wasn't part of the series. It didn't matter who won there, so it wasn't going to change the series result. It was all about promoting the game in America to a new market. And 12,000 odd fans came out to watch the game. And New South Wales won the match 30-18. And it pretty much inspired no one.
Although it did sell a lot of masking tape, because when Peter Sterling couldn't break through that banner because of masking tape, a lot of people were like, man, you can use this to hold a house together. It's great. It's fantastic. It was, what it showed? The thing that game showed, and taking it to the United States, was that the rugby league authorities had 100% embraced that State of Origin was a vehicle that could drive the game forward. And that's the big thing that comes out of that exhibition match, that it had now everyone understood that there was something special, that we needed to show people this, because if we show them what we're seeing, they're going to start to look at rugby league as a sport they want to watch more often. And so that's almost as big of a achievement as trying to take a game to the United States itself.
Exactly. In the end, though, because there was no real follow-up, the only value this game serves is, well, served in the past anyway. New South Wales officials and fans would often argue that the game should be counted. Therefore, the 1987 series would have been declared a tie, not a win to Queensland. Whereas Queensland officials have always said, it's an exhibition game, we should scratch it from the record books so that they can keep their Origin Series victory in 87.
Yeah. Look, from my unbiased point of view, is that we should win the whole series. It's not a draw. We won the series. I mean, we won on foreign soil. Come on now.
This is the argument that New South Wales is going to make, because if it's a drawn series, and given that New South Wales won in 86, they'd be declared the winner of the series.
And the weird thing about it too is that for up until probably the early 2000s, this game was a tipping point between who had won the most State of Origin games and who would won the most series. And so it was a real talking point for a long time. It's not so much of a talking point now, unfortunately. But yeah, it's funny that there's that quirk in State of Origin's history.
Exactly. Now, 1988. Wow. The big thing anyone's going to remember from this is Game 2, when Wally Lewis got sin-binned. He was one of many. I mean, let's have a look at who got sin-binned in that game. It was Steve Roach, Greg Conescu, Laurie Daly. I think it was Laurie Daly. Phil Daly, sorry. I knew I'd get that one wrong. Yep. Phil Daly, Wally Lewis, and Steve Folkes. 5 players all got sent to the sin bin in that game. When Wally Lewis got put in the bin, and this is at Lang Park, the fans were so incensed that they threw away their beer. They were throwing cans of 4X onto the field, which caused the game to be halted while they had to get people out there to clean up the mess so they could get back to playing the game again. And the interesting thing that I later found out was that sitting in the crowd, right behind the New South Wales interchange bench, was the New South Wales under-18s team who had played in the game beforehand. And 2 of those players were Brad Fittler and Tim Brasher. And they said they said this was one of the most amazing things they ever experienced in rugby league.
And how about the balls on Mick Stone to send that many players off the field? Like, exactly. Holy hell. Like, there's not many referees would be willing to do that these days. I reckon that Harrigan would have done it, but I can't think of too many other referees that would do something like that, especially in the State of Origin game.
Exactly. Despite all of that, Queensland still won the series.
Mm-hmm. Clean sweep too.
Yeah, it was a clean sweep. It was too. And it was pretty much when Queensland were at their absolute peak, because they had that great mix of great new young talent coming through, experienced players who are in the prime of their careers, and included two bloody immortals in Wally Lewis and Mal Meninga there.
Yeah.
Phenomenal outfit, and they were just about to get better.
Yeah, and so a couple of the interesting things about this series, the crowd average 25,000 people in this series, which it seems so tiny these days. I mean, the whole crowd attendance was 75,000 for the 3 games, which if you got that now in Sydney, they'd say, oh, State of Origin is dying, which is kind of funny. Top try scorer in that series was Alan Langer with 4 tries in 3 games. How about that? He's way too small. He's way too small.
That's a great stat.
Yeah. Incredible.
Now, next after that was the 1989 series, and my goodness, we've heard about the Rorke's Drift test from 1914 when England beat Australia with so many players off the field with injuries and whatnot. Game 2 of this series saw Queensland practically repeat the feat. So, I've got it written down here. In the 18th minute, Alan Langer broke his ankle. In the 29th minute, Mal Meninga went off with a fractured eye socket. Paul Vaughton went off at half-time and failed to return with an injury to his elbow. In the 57th minute, Michael Hancock left the field with a shoulder injury. In the 75th minute, Bobby Lindner was stretchered off the field. And Queensland still won the game. They won 16-12 thanks to a try at the end by Wally Lewis, one of the most famous tries where he's beaten all the players and then he's just got past Gary Jack at the end and he's sitting there celebrating, both fists pumped as he's celebrating towards the sky after winning the game for Queensland. And it was quite fitting that he got past Gary Jack in the end there, because that was the same year Gary Jack was named the Golden Boot best player in the world, and deservingly so. He was that good.
Yeah, and did it in Sydney at the Sydney Football Stadium.
Yep.
Just an unbelievable, one of the greatest wins by any team in rugby league history. They were down to 12 men on the field, and they still won. And I think that it's weird. I feel as though this game gets missing in State of Origin history. This game should be a rallying point every single year for Queensland. What an incredible effort. Absolutely incredible. And it's not like they lost players. It's not like they lost a winger and stuff. They were losing their best players, and they still won. It just absolutely amazing.
Certainly was. I need to correct myself there too. Gary Jack was Golden Boot winner in 1986. Wally Lewis was the Golden Boot winner in 89.
Okay.
But still.
Wally Lewis, he probably deserved it at some point. That was back when it actually mattered to the Golden Boot.
Yeah, when it was awarded to the right people.
Yeah.
But,
now we go by the King of Rugby League awards. They're the real ones now.
That's a carrot for down the line.
Yeah, I can't wait for that one.
Yeah, I would argue that was, more than anything, that was a series that made Queensland, gave them that aura. Because from that point on, we saw so many times that you could never, ever count Queensland out of a game. How many times did you see after that? They come from behind to win a game late in the match. The fact that they won that game like that was sort of the start of that. It epitomised the Queenslander spirit, I guess, as we hear about so often.
Yeah, and how many times have we seen games where New South Wales has everything lined up to win, and it'll be about the 60th minute, 65th minute, and Queensland are out on their feet, they're busted, they're just holding it together, and you're like, oh, here we go, New South Wales are going to go on and win this one, and then somehow 10 minutes later, Queensland are playing like just Hercules, It really is incredible what they managed to do in these games. And as you say, this is one of those matches that really cements that sort of determination that they have to win matches, down to 12 players on foreign soil, and they still do it. It's infuriating.
That's the best way to sum it up.
Yeah.
Now, in 1990, New South Wales made a host of changes. You think 7 was big. This is game 1. 1987. These are just the debutants for New South Wales that year. Mm-hmm. Okay. Rod Wishart, Ricky Walford, Ricky Stewart, Ian Roberts, Graham Lyons, Jeff Tuvey. That's just for New South Wales.
Mm-hmm.
Queensland brought in Steve Walters and Mark Coyne on the bench.
They'll go all right, I think.
But it worked because New South Wales won that series. They won the first game 8-0.
Mm-hmm.
The second game was the first time they took a match in the actual State of Origin series outside of Brisbane and Sydney, where they played at the old and now non-existent Olympic Park in Melbourne. And 25,800 people turned up to that game, where New South Wales won 12-6.
And probably the most incredible thing about that game is that they managed to get 25,000 people into Olympic Park.
Still don't know how they did it.
Yeah, I mean, how, like, that uncomfortably would seat 15,000.
That's been pretty accurate. I've done a fair bit of work at that old venue there, and I don't know how they got 25,000 there.
Yeah, crazy, absolutely crazy.
They might have been using those people who count tickets at GWS home games.
I would love to see, and I'd just love to see pictures of the crowd and see where they were stuffing people in at that stadium. Like, I just can't even imagine it.
No, it was crazy. So yeah, that was a fantastic series. It pretty much had everything. You had a great host of young players coming through who got what Origin was about. They were absolutely committed to it. That was for New South Wales, and Queensland were playing with that dogged tenacity that they'd always had. Because the games were not floggings or anything like that. They were very tight, very keenly fought, and Queensland won the dead rubber the third match 14-10.
The interesting thing about this series for me is that you start to see players coming into the New South Wales team in particular, and even the Queensland team to a certain extent, that are the foundations of the teams that, I guess, when you and I started to really be super invested in State of Origin as young kids, basically, and growing up with State of Origin, and you're starting to see these names that to us were our state of origin players from our sort of, era is the wrong word, but when we were growing up and they were our guys, it's
Yeah.
cool to see that in this series.
Absolutely. I still remember this series. I don't know why, because it wasn't like there was one where they had crazy incidents like massive brawls or, crazy antics by one player here or there or beer cans coming on the field. There's none of that. It was pure brilliant football from start to finish in all games by a bunch of players in their absolute prime who deserve to be there. Just a great series.
Yeah.
And to sum up the end of the Wally Lewis era, we're going to look at the 1991 series. And this is one that did have plenty of incidents.
Yeah, definitely.
Mostly by the name of Mark Geyer.
Yeah, and we've talked about this. We're going to talk to MG. And he's the first person we've talked about wanting to interview. The thing we don't want to do when we interview MG is just focus on this event because everyone asks him about this event. But the well-known thing is they basically said to MG and they said, go out and wreak havoc. Now, if you say that to somebody from Mount Druitt, you should expect havoc. And that's exactly what he did. He went out and just played this role of I will destroy everything that's in a maroon jumper. And in a crazy, crazy irony, it was probably the reason why he didn't play again for New South Wales. They just felt like he'd gone too far. But that's exactly what they'd asked him to do.
It's exactly right. And it was an important game too. And that was the reason why they brought him in, because they needed someone to put the Queenslanders off their game. Queensland won the first game 6-4, and New South Wales won the second match 14-12. I think that was the game where Michael O'Connor famously kicked a sideline field goal in the driving rain.
One of the, maybe, it's got to be top 5 games ever, just for all the stuff that happened in it.
Yeah, that was a phenomenal match.
Yeah.
Steve Valdis had one of the best games of his career in that match from memory too.
Yeah.
And so he came to the series decider at Lang Park, of all places, Game 3. And, MG gets brought in to be some I was going to say, maniac enforcer. That's pretty much the role he had.
Well, it's interesting because the confrontation with Wally Lewis was in that second game.
That's right.
And he just that was his job. That's what they asked him to do, and he went out and he did it.
And that's the thing, it worked because it got New South Wales the win and over the line.
And it got him back into the series. It's really unfortunate that in some ways that he's thought of as the player that did that on that day, because he was such an incredible player in so many other areas of the game. And this was probably an incident that it's not that it tarnished his career, but it really coloured his career, I guess is the best way to put it. And really, I guess, pigeonholed him in the eyes of certain people. And that was unfair because he was so much more as a player. He was an incredible player, and should have played so many more Origin games, so many more Test matches. But what a moment to have. And when he was standing up to Wally Lewis and everyone thought Wally Lewis is going to be destroyed here. And David Manson's there yelling at them both. It's one of the great moments in sporting history. It's
kind of funny because you see David Manson there, who looks like he's completely incapable of separating these two players, until Benny Lice came along, who's shorter than Manson, and made Manson look like, maybe he's got a chance.
Yeah.
I don't know what Benny was trying to do. I've never ever thought of Benny Lice as being a peacemaker, especially if you read some of his comments in recent times about some footy stuff. He doesn't really come across as someone who's trying to create peace anywhere.
No, and it's interesting that it didn't happen because, man, how many people could have stood in front of Mark Geyer at that moment and got in his face like Wally Lewis did and live to tell the tale.
it, it was phenomenal because it showed too that it didn't matter how much of a maniac you were and how much bigger you were. Wally Lewis stood down to no one.
Exactly.
And that was what made him so good. A lot of people remember the great things that he did with the ball, but a lot of people don't realize he was a very, very good defender, and he always punched above his weight in everything he did. There was a great tackle he pulled off. I think it might have been an 85 or 86 test against New Zealand, and it was against some big second row. It could have even been a prop forward. I cannot remember his name, unfortunately, but he crunched him. Immense one-on-one tackle.
Oh, who was that? Yeah, I've seen that tackle. He really did. He blasted him.
Yeah, flat, just creamy, just looking and going, God, that is still a big hit by today's standards, no matter how you look at it. It was intense. And it was completely illegal. There's nothing wrong with it. Just absolutely flattened the bloke. And you just look at him going, that was Wally Lewis. He was that good in attack and defence. Everyone remembers the attack, obviously, like they do with Joey. But
yeah,
the defence was equal, undoubtedly.
Definitely. And he was a big dude. Like, for a 5'8", a properly big dude. And as a competitor, like a psychopath.
Exactly.
Like, just there's no one that has been more of a competitor than Wally Lewis in the whole history of the game. That you could say, oh yeah, he was more competitive than Wally Lewis. Wally Lewis was going to give you every last ounce of what he had to give to win, and then he was going to give more, and it shone at its brightest at state of origin level. He did it for Australia, he did it at club level, but at state of origin, when it was fair to say at this point they could say the best of the best, he was just like a force of nature.
It was, and he was absolutely passionate about winning. And this was seen in Game 3, his last ever State of Origin game. No one knew about it, but he knew that the crowd would get behind him if they found out about it. And knowing that it was such a tight series, he made an announcement before the game. Well, not an announcement. He told the ground announcer before the game started to reveal to the crowd over the loudspeaker that this was going to be Wally Lewis's last ever State of Origin game. Wally knew that would help because this is at Lang Park. He knew that would fire up the crowd, get them chanting home their team. And so, with about 10 minutes to go in the game, the ground announcer makes the announcement that this is going to be Wally Lewis's last ever game of State of Origin. The crowd starts chanting, and it's going crazy for him. Queensland wins the game 14-12 in the series. Wally Lewis bows out the winner.
And that's exactly how it should have been. As a New South Wales person, and I love New South Wales, I'm super passionate about it. Even when we've been losing, I've been super passionate about it. I wouldn't change this result. I wouldn't change it because Wally Lewis deserved to go out a winner. He earned it. He earned it as much as anyone's ever earned anything in this game. And just an icon. And wow, I mean, real. And this is why we called this the Wally Lewis era, because from the start of this whole series right up until this point, he was a real force of nature, and he was who New South Wales had to try and overcome. And there would be series that we'd beat him in, but damn, we had to push ourselves right to the limit to beat him. What a person, what a player, and what a man to start this series about. Just an icon of the game.
Yeah, I mean, there's no words, no way about it. He made Origin. Arthur Beetson started it with a punch, but Lewis was on the field when that happened. He was there from the day one. And he saw how passionate Beetson was. He ran with it. And yeah, it literally got to the point where, especially those last 5-6 years of his time in Origin there, that it was New South Wales versus Wally Lewis. There's even stories when Wally Lewis came and played test matches for Australia in Sydney the Sydney crowd would boo Lewis when he came onto the field to captain Australia.
Yeah, and it
got to that level.
Yeah, and I mean, he was just something completely different to anything I think we've really seen in rugby league up until this point. In that he was so recognisable as, this is a guy that played for Australia and was one of Australia's great players ever. I think he's the greatest 5'8" of all time, personally. But he was still seen as a Queenslander even when he played for Australia. And I know at the time that really upset him. And I think in recent years he's talked about how he's had to let that go to a certain extent because it really did make him angry. And at the time it was infuriating to him. But I think it also shows just what he was to Queensland Rugby League and what he symbolised to New South Wales Rugby League and how important he was to this whole series. And it makes you wonder where State of Origin would be without somebody like Wally Lewis, who, I mean, New South Wales has never had somebody that has been able to say that they play with that same sort of fire in every single game, in every single minute that he did. And
I was going to say, the closest you probably get is if you were able to take, say, someone like Jonathan Thurston, skill-wise,
mm-hmm.
and then attach, say, the passion of hatred that Queenslanders have for Paul Gallen to it.
Yeah, and then give him the in-game, almost having a coach on the field that you have with Cameron Smith, where he does the right thing every single time. And he knows when to let his teammates do the work and then when it is to stand up and do it. Oh, and also he has the timing to win a game of a Darren Lockyer. It's all of these things come together where you had this perfect State of Origin player in Wally Lewis. Incredible. Just incredible.
Phenomenal human. It's one of the great treasures of being an old bastard like I am that I got to see a lot of Wally Lewis's representative career. He was so highly regarded too by the Queensland Rugby League that Wally was obviously offered contracts to move to Sydney and play with Sydney clubs there, most notably Manly and I think the Roosters also.
Mm-hmm.
And they were offering him contracts that would be competitive with what players are getting today. That's how much they were willing to throw at him. And the Queensland Rugby League refused to let him leave Queensland to play down there because they knew how important he was, not just to the Origin team, but to Queensland Rugby League overall.
Yeah.
That's how big this human was. Yeah, he was phenomenal.
Yeah. It makes you wonder, like, if you could put a marketing value on it, and I'm sure somebody can, if you could put a marketing value on what Wally Lewis has meant to Queensland Rugby League, I mean, it's got to be in the tens of millions of dollars. And to the game overall, it's got to be in the hundreds of millions of dollars and literally in the hundreds of millions of dollars.
Yeah.
Brilliant. And that he did, nobody questions Wally Lewis having a statue, and there's a reason for that. Outside of Lang Park, I've been there. I've had my picture taken with it. It was incredible to see and to be at that place that Wally Lewis built.
I can go one better.
Oh, go on.
And this is going to sound weird. I went to a game at Amy Park, and he was working with the Channel 9 commentary team, and I saw him outside the lift as he was going up.
Yeah.
I said, "Oh, Wally, how you going?" And he put his hand out and shook my hand and went, "I just touched the hand of a god."
Oh, man. Damn.
He's got big hands. He's got big hands on him too. No wonder he was so bloody confident when he went into a fight. It's like he's throwing bloody saucepans at people. God damn.
Throwing lunch boxes. Yeah, it would be wonderful to get him on to talk on the podcast with him. I mean, I'm sure he's got a million people trying to talk to him, but isn't it great that our sport has somebody like Wally Lewis, hey?
Yeah. Oh,
it's so amazing.
Yeah. So that's I think we're pretty apt in saying that was the Wally Lewis era because I think, as you rightly said, without him, I don't think Origin gets to the point where it's at today, let alone to what, the heights and the hype it had around it during the 80s, and especially going into the 90s. Possibly the most important part of Origin is to come up, which is going through that 90s period where it survived throughout the biggest and most tumultuous period in rugby league's modern history, and that was Super League.
Yeah, and went through some tough times, but also created, and this is important too, created new legends and new legendary moments. And as we're moving out of an era where as you say, Wally Lewis was there on day one, game one. And as you move out of those moments and you go into a new era where it is completely new players that don't have that connection to the first game, and yet this series still provides origin moments. And also super competitive too through the next era. And really, probably I think it's fair to say grew upon the legend and turned the Rugby League State of Origin series from being something that Rugby League knew was special to all of a sudden Australia and outside of Australia started to take notice how special this series was. And that's what we'll go into in the next episode of our 3-part Origin series.
Absolutely. So on that note, we will we'll sign off on this one and we'll get to work on the next episode.
Thank you, everyone, for listening.